My name is Alexandra Harrison, and at 22 years old, I should have been celebrating my Yale graduation with pride. Instead, I watched my father Richard rise from his seat during my award acceptance, his face twisted with anger. "I am cutting you off financially," he announced to the silent auditorium. "You are not my real daughter anyway." The room gasped collectively. I smiled, walked back to the podium with steady steps, and pulled out an envelope from my purse. "Since we are sharing DNA secrets today," my stepmother Kathleen's face turned white as I began. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I expose the truth my father never wanted revealed. I grew up in an affluent suburb of Boston, in a sprawling colonial house with perfectly manicured lawns and a swimming pool that hosted summer parties for my father's business associates. Until I was 8, life felt almost perfect. My mother Elaine was my anchor, a warm, intelligent woman who balanced her career as an art history professor with motherhood. She would spend weekends taking me to museums, teaching me about Renaissance painters while other kids watched cartoons. Those early years gave me a foundation of confidence and curiosity that would later become my lifeline. Everything changed when Mom was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. The disease moved quickly, transforming our home from a place of laughter to a sterile, whispered environment of doctor visits and medication schedules. 6 months after diagnosis, she was gone. I remember standing at her funeral in a black dress that itched at the collar, watching my father Richard stare stonily ahead, his hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. Dad was a successful investment banker, always impeccably dressed, always demanding excellence. Before Mom died, his perfectionism seemed balanced by her warmth. Without her, his exacting standards became the dominant force in our household. My report cards needed to be flawless. My piano recitals required weeks of practice. My appearance had to reflect the Harrison family standards. But no matter how perfectly I performed, something had shifted in how he looked at me, as if I had become a painful reminder of what he had lost. 2 years after Mom died, Richard brought Kathleen home for dinner. She was younger than my mother by nearly a decade, with sleek blonde hair and a carefully cultivated laugh that never quite reached her eyes. 6 months later, they were married, and Kathleen moved into our home with her 14-year-old son, Brandon. "You will be siblings now," my father announced, as if declaring a business merger. Brandon looked as thrilled about this arrangement as I felt. Our new family dynamic revealed itself quickly. When alone with me, Kathleen would make subtle comments about my appearance. "Those jeans are quite snug, Alexandra. We should work on finding you some more flattering options." Or, "Your mother might have let you wear your hair that way, but it really does nothing for your face shape." Each comment delivered with a smile that dared me to complain. If I mentioned anything to my father, Kathleen would express confusion, insisting she was only trying to help me adjust to having a woman's guidance again. Within a year, my mother's touches began disappearing from our home. Her collection of art books was boxed up because they cluttered the living room. The kitchen was remodeled, eliminating the hand-painted tiles she had installed. Even her garden was redesigned into something more appropriate for entertaining. Each erasure felt like losing her all over again. Brandon initially made my life miserable, putting his feet on my homework, making noise when I was studying, and calling me professor when I read books instead of watching television. But something shifted during our second year as step-siblings. I overheard a vicious argument between him and Kathleen, her voice hissing, "Remember where your tuition comes from." After that, Brandon's hostility transformed into something like silent solidarity. He wasn't friendly, but he would occasionally run interference when Kathleen was being particularly cruel. As I entered high school, I threw myself into academics. If I couldn't win my father's affection, I could at least earn his respect. I joined debate team, ran for student government, maintained a perfect grade point average, and took every advanced placement course offered. I stayed up until 2 a.m. studying, fueled by the brief nods of approval my achievements occasionally earned from Richard. Senior year brought college application season. With my academic record and extracurricular activities, I received acceptance letters from several prestigious universities. My father had always spoken about Stanford, his alma mater, the Harrison legacy, he called it. but Yale offered me a partial scholarship and had the specific literature program I wanted. When the acceptance letter came, I felt a rare moment of certainty about my own path. Yale Richard frowned at dinner when I shared my decision. I thought we discussed Stanford. Yale offered me a scholarship, I explained, and their comparative literature program is exactly what I want. Literature, Kathleen interjected with a light laugh. Richard, darling, perhaps we should discuss the practicality of such a degree. I can double major in economics, I offered quickly, seeing his expression darken. After a tense silence, he nodded curtly. Fine. We will make it work financially. A Harrison should be able to attend an Ivy League school without scholarships, but if this is what you insist on, so be it. My college years brought both freedom and new tensions. During my freshman year, I called home weekly, as expected, updating my father on classes and grades. His responses were brief, often distracted. Visits home for holidays became increasingly strained affairs, with Kathleen orchestrating elaborate dinners where she would spotlight Brandon's business school accomplishments while asking pointed questions about what exactly one does with a literature degree. Despite having promised to cover my education, Richard began making comments about expenses. Do you really need that research trip to London? Books cost how much this semester? Each question delivered with raised eyebrows and thinly veiled disappointment. I took on part-time jobs at the library and as a teaching assistant, trying to cover personal expenses without asking for more. My roommate Jessica became the family I needed during those years. Smart, outspoken, and fiercely loyal, she witnessed my phone calls with Richard and Kathleen and didn't hesitate to offer her opinion. Your stepmother is straight-up manipulative, and your dad is either blind or choosing not to see it, she declared. After overhearing a particularly demeaning call where Kathleen had suggested I might want to consider a nutrition course. Given my struggle with the freshman 15, which was entirely fictional. During junior year, things took a strange turn. Richard called to discuss tuition payment and mentioned financial restructuring that might affect our arrangement. When I asked for clarification, he became irritated, saying, "This is not something a young woman needs to concern herself with. Focus on maintaining your grades." The dismissal stung, but beneath my hurt, something felt off about the situation. The Christmas break before my final semester was particularly tense. Richard spent most of the time on business calls while Kathleen hosted a series of holiday parties where she introduced me with the perpetually embarrassing, "This is Alexandra, she is at Yale, studying literature of all things. We are still hoping she will consider law school after graduation." The last dinner before I returned to campus, I noticed my father observing me with an odd expression, something beyond his usual critical assessment. When I asked if everything was all right, he started slightly, then said, "You look more like your mother every day." Before I could respond, Kathleen swiftly changed the subject to their upcoming vacation in Aspen. As graduation approached, I held on to hope that completing my degree with honors might finally earn the recognition I had spent years seeking. Perhaps I thought standing on that stage in my cap and gown would transform me in my father's eyes from a disappointment to a daughter he could be proud of. Despite everything, I sent 3 tickets to the ceremony, for Richard, Kathleen, and Brandon, along with a handwritten note expressing how much their presence would mean to me. The morning of graduation dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect May days that felt deliberately designed for new beginnings. I woke early in my dorm room, sunlight streaming through the window onto the dress I had carefully selected and hung the night before, a simple navy blue sheath that would look appropriate under my graduation gown. Jessica was already up making coffee in our small shared kitchenette. "Today is the day, valedictorian," she said, handing me a steaming mug. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous, excited, terrified," I admitted, checking my phone for the 3rd time that morning. No messages from my family yet, but it was still early. 4 years of killing yourself to maintain perfect grades while working part-time jobs, and you are graduating at the top of your class from Yale, Jessica said firmly. Be proud of that, regardless of what your family says or does today. As I showered and began doing my hair, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The countless late nights studying the research papers I had poured my heart into, the professors who had mentored me and championed my work. Despite the constant pressure from home, I had found myself at Yale, discovered a passion for comparative literature that had resulted in a thesis gaining attention from academic publishers. For perhaps the first time, I had built something that was entirely mine, not shaped by my father's expectations or Kathleen's undermining. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "We will arrive approximately 30 minutes before ceremony. Do not be late meeting us at the designated family area." No congratulations, no expression of pride, just logistics and an implied command. I texted back a simple confirmation with the exact meeting location, then returned to getting ready. Jessica helped me zip up my dress, then held my graduation gown as I slipped into it. "You look like a total badass intellectual," she announced as I adjusted the honor cords and medallion I had earned. We took several photos together in our regalia, capturing smiles that were genuine for the first time in weeks, as the stress of final exams faded into accomplishment. On our walk across campus, we ran into Professor Diana Martin, my thesis advisor and mentor throughout my time at Yale. She embraced me warmly, her eyes bright with pride. "Alexandra, I was hoping to catch you before the ceremony," she said. "I wanted to tell you personally that the department has selected your thesis for the annual publication award. It is a significant honor." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely moved. "I could not have done it without your guidance." "Nonsense. This was all your brilliance," she insisted. "Your family must be bursting with pride today." I managed a smile that did not quite reach my eyes. They should be arriving soon. "Well, I look forward to meeting them at the reception," Professor Martin said. "They raised an extraordinary young woman." As she walked away, Jessica squeezed my arm supportively. We both knew the gap between Professor Martin's assumption and reality. We reached the family meeting area, already crowded with excited parents, clutching flower bouquets and cameras. I scanned the gathering, anxiety building as I searched for familiar faces. Finally, I spotted them, my father checking his watch impatiently, Kathleen adjusting her designer dress and oversized hat, Brandon standing slightly apart, looking uncomfortable in his suit. "There they are," I murmured to Jessica, straightening my shoulders before approaching. Alexandra, my father, acknowledged with a nod. The traffic was abysmal. I told Kathleen we should have left earlier. "Hi, Dad," I said, leaning in for a quick awkward hug that he barely returned. "Kathleen, Brandon, thank you for coming." Kathleen air kissed near my cheek, careful not to disturb her immaculate makeup. "That gown does nothing for anyone's figure, does it? But I suppose that is tradition." She adjusted my hood with unnecessary force. "There, at least you look presentable." Brandon gave me a brief, genuine hug. "Congratulations," he said quietly. Then, lowering his voice further, he added, "Dad has been on his phone all morning with lawyers, something about trusts and accounts." Before I could ask what he meant, a photographer approached offering to take family photos. What followed was an uncomfortable session of forced smiles and stiff poses, my father checking his phone between shots, Kathleen positioning herself prominently, me trying to look like this was the joyous family occasion it was supposed to be. Around us, other families laughed together, parents beaming with undisguised pride, siblings teasing graduates about their regalia. The contrast was painful. I introduced my family to Jessica's parents, who had brought her younger brother and grandparents to celebrate. Their warmth and excitement only highlighted the coldness of my own family's response. "We should find our seats," Richard announced abruptly, cutting short the conversation with Jessica's family. "Alexandra needs to join the procession." As I turned to line up with my fellow graduates, Brandon caught my arm. "Alexandra, wait." He glanced toward our parents, who were already walking away. "Dad is in a weird mood. Be prepared." I overheard him and Mom arguing about some financial decisions, and your name came up. "What do you mean?" I asked, but the line was moving forward. "Just be prepared," he repeated, then hurried after Richard and Kathleen. The processional began, pomp and circumstance playing as we filed into the ceremony venue. I searched the sea of faces as I entered, finally locating my family several rows back. Richard and Kathleen appeared to be having a heated, whispered argument, not even noticing my entrance. Only Brandon looked up, giving me a small, worried smile. I took my seat among the other graduates, the special position reserved for those receiving academic honors, making me easily visible from the audience. My fellow honor students congratulated each other, exchanging excited whispers about future plans and the distinguished speakers on the program. I tried to join in their enthusiasm, but my attention kept drifting back to my family, to the tension evident even from a distance. The commencement program indicated I would be receiving special recognition during the awards segment before the conferring of degrees. Under normal circumstances, this would be a moment of pride. Today it felt like walking into unknown territory without a map. Something was wrong beyond the usual family dynamics, but I had no idea what storm was brewing. As the ceremony began with the university president welcoming families and congratulating graduates, I found myself watching my father instead of the stage. His expression was dark, his attention focused on Kathleen rather than the ceremony. She appeared to be placating him, her hand on his arm, her expression, a practiced mask of calm, that did nothing to hide the satisfaction in her eyes. I had seen that look before, when she had convinced my father to sell my mother's piano because it took up too much space, when she had persuaded him that my study abroad proposal was extravagant and unnecessary. It was the look of someone who had won a private victory at someone else's expense. My stomach tightened with apprehension. And now Dean Lawrence announced, his voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. We come to a special portion of our ceremony where we recognize extraordinary academic achievement. I straightened in my seat, smoothing my gown. Despite my anxiety about my family's strange behavior, part of me still hoped this moment might change something, that seeing me recognized publicly might finally make my father proud. The Faculty Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Comparative Literature goes to a student whose work has already been accepted for publication in 2 academic journals. Her thesis on cross-cultural literary influences has been described by the department as groundbreaking and worthy of a doctoral candidate. Please join me in congratulating Alexandra Harrison. Applause erupted as I rose from my seat and made my way to the stage. I climbed the steps, carefully crossing to where Dean Lawrence stood with my award, a medal, and an engraved certificate. As he placed the medal around my neck, I caught sight of my father in the audience. Rather than applauding, he was staring at me with an expression I could not quite interpret, something between anger and calculation. I smiled for the official photograph with the dean, then moved to the podium for the brief acceptance speech I had prepared. I want to express my gratitude to the Comparative Literature Department. I began, particularly Professor Diana Martin, whose mentorship has been invaluable. I also want to thank my friends who supported me throughout this journey. This has gone on long enough. The voice cut through the auditorium like a thunderclap. My father had risen to his feet, his face flushed with anger. The audience fell silent, hundreds of faces turning toward the disruption. My words died in my throat as I gripped the edges of the podium. Richard, Kathleen hissed, tugging at his sleeve, though her expression suggested she was not entirely surprised by this outburst. No, he said, shaking off her hand. I have been financing a lie for far too long. Dean Lawrence stepped forward. Sir, perhaps we could discuss any concerns after the ceremony. My father ignored him, his attention fixed solely on me. Alexandra, I am publicly withdrawing all financial support effective immediately. Your trust fund, your apartment allowance, everything. It is time you knew the truth that your mother and I kept from you. The audience was completely silent now, the collective intake of breath creating a vacuum in the massive space. I stood frozen at the podium, the certificate in my hands, suddenly weightless and meaningless. You are not my real daughter anyway, Richard announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. Your mother had an affair. I have known since you were a child. I tried to raise you as my own out of respect for Elaine, but I am done pretending. The DNA test confirmed it years ago. You are not a Harrison. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the ceremony hall. I could see Jessica half standing in outrage, her parents restraining her. Professor Martin's face was a mask of shock and indignation. Brandon had gone pale, his body rigid with what looked like mortified disbelief. In that moment, fragments of memory flashed through my mind, My father's increasing emotional distance after my mother died, his reluctance to display my childhood photos, his odd comment at Christmas about how much I resembled my mother. A cruel picture was forming, but something about it felt fundamentally wrong. Kathleen was watching me with barely concealed triumph, her hand on Richard's arm appearing supportive while her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was her victory, the final severing of my connection to the Harrison family, the complete erasure of my mother's legacy. Time seemed to slow as I stood on that stage, the weight of public humiliation pressing down on me. I had spent my entire life trying to earn this man's approval, restructuring my dreams and ambitions to fit his expectations, only to be disowned in front of hundreds of people on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. But something unexpected was happening inside me. Instead of collapsing under the weight of this revelation, I felt a strange clarity emerging. Years of emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and conditional love crystallized into a single understanding. This moment was not about truth, it was about power, and for once I held more of it than Richard realized. I reached into my purse, which I had placed beside the podium, and withdrew a sealed envelope I had been carrying for weeks, my insurance policy that I had hoped never to use. My hands were surprisingly steady as I looked directly at my father, then at Kathleen, whose smug expression faltered slightly at my lack of tears. I took a deep breath and leaned toward the microphone once more. "Since we are sharing DNA secrets today," I said clearly, "perhaps we should tell the whole truth." 3 months before graduation, during spring break, I had returned to the family home while everyone was away. Richard and Kathleen were on a business trip to London, and Brandon was on a ski vacation with friends. I had told them I was staying at Yale to work on my thesis, but in reality I needed access to financial documents for my aid applications. For my entire college career, my father had promised to handle tuition payments, but recently the financial aid office had contacted me about incomplete paperwork and missing payments. My attempts to discuss this with Richard had been met with irritation and dismissal. With graduation approaching, and my account at Yale showing an alarming balance, I had decided to look for the documents myself. The house was eerily quiet as I let myself in with my key. Family photos lined the hallway. Richard and Kathleen at charity galas, Brandon in his business school graduation regalia. Even old photos of my father from his college days. What was noticeably absent were pictures of my mother, or of me beyond group shots at formal events. I had grown accustomed to this erasure, but entering the empty house brought fresh awareness of how thoroughly I had been removed from the family narrative. My father's office was at the end of the hall, a space I had rarely been allowed to enter as a child. The heavy oak door was locked, but I knew where the spare key was hidden, in a small compartment of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a hiding place unchanged since my childhood. Inside the office, dark wood paneling and leather furniture created an atmosphere of old-world authority. I went directly to the filing cabinet where my father kept important documents. The financial aid forms would be in the education section, logically filed with Brandon's college records. What I found instead were folders of strange receipts, payments to an address in Chicago, transfers to accounts I did not recognize, and medical bills for people named Trevor and Lucy. More curious than alarmed at first, I continued searching, eventually opening my father's desk drawers when the filing cabinet yielded nothing about my tuition. In the bottom drawer beneath a false panel, I discovered by accident, I found a collection of letters and photographs that made my blood run cold. The letters were addressed to my dearest Richard and signed by someone named Margaret. They referenced our children and our life together. The photos showed my father with a woman I had never seen and 2 teenagers who bore a striking resemblance to him, the same eyes, the same distinctive Harrison jawline. My hands trembling, I continued reading through the correspondence pieces, falling into place with sickening clarity. Richard had been maintaining a second family in Chicago for at least 15 years, since before my mother's death. Financial records showed regular payments for private school tuition, a mortgage, and vacations. I even found evidence of recent college tuition payments to Northwestern University, while my own tuition at Yale had apparently gone unpaid. I was still processing this discovery when I heard the front door open. Quickly returning everything to its place, I slipped out of the office through the connecting door to the library, emerging into the hallway just as Brandon came in, his ski trip apparently cut short. His surprise at seeing me quickly turned to suspicion. "What are you doing here? Dad said you were staying at school." "I needed some books, I left." I lied, gesturing vaguely toward the library. "What happened to skiing?" Brandon studied my face. "Food poisoning hit half the group," he said after a moment. "Alexandra, were you in Dad's office?" The directness of his question, combined with the shock of what I had just discovered, broke through my composure. "Do you know about Margaret?" I asked bluntly. "And Trevor and Lucy?" His face went pale. "You found out about Chicago. You knew." The betrayal felt like a physical blow. "You knew he has another family while he has been making me work part-time jobs to cover my expenses." Brandon ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted. "I found out 2 years ago. Mom knows too. That is why she has been, well, the way she is with you. She found out about Margaret right after they got married, but instead of divorcing him, she used it as leverage. Dad pays her ridiculous alimony in advance, essentially, and she keeps quiet about his double life." "But why would she hate me? I am not part of that arrangement." Brandon's expression was pitying. "Because you are Elaine's daughter. Mom always felt she was Richard's second choice after your mother. When she found out about Margaret, she realized she was actually his third choice. She has been systematically erasing your mother from this house and by extension you." The revelation left me reeling. "And my tuition? The financial aid office says payments have been missing. Dad has been moving money around. The market has been bad, and supporting 3 households is expensive even for him. Mom insisted her lifestyle cannot be compromised, and he would never shortchange his real kids in Chicago, so Yale stopped getting paid," I finished flatly. The next day I made an appointment with Harold Winters, our family lawyer. I had met him a few times at family events, and remembered him speaking fondly of my mother. When I arrived at his office and explained what I had discovered, his professional demeanor cracked. "Alexandra, I have been concerned about certain movements in the family accounts for some time, but client confidentiality prevented me from reaching out to you," he explained. "However, now that you have asked directly, there are things you should know." Harold revealed that my maternal grandmother, Eleanor, had established a trust fund for my education before her death. This fund had been under Richard's control as trustee, but was legally designated solely for my educational expenses. According to Harold's records, Richard had been systematically diverting money from this trust to other accounts for years, a clear breach of fiduciary duty and potentially illegal. Furthermore, Harold continued, "Your mother left a separate trust that becomes available to you at 25 or upon completion of your undergraduate degree, whichever comes first. Richard has no control over this trust, though I believe he has concealed its existence from you." Over the following weeks I worked with Harold to gather official documentation of everything: the misappropriated trust funds, the evidence of Richard's second family, and Kathleen's knowledge and apparent blackmail. I compiled it all into a comprehensive file, making copies that Harold kept secure in his office. "I hope you never need to use this," Harold told me, as he handed me an envelope containing key documents. "But if Richard attempts to cut you off financially before your graduation, this will protect you legally." I carried that envelope with me everywhere as graduation approached, a physical reminder that I was no longer powerless in the face of my father's manipulation. I had never intended to expose his secrets publicly. Despite everything, some part of me still hoped for reconciliation, for acknowledgement of my achievements, for the fatherly pride I had sought my entire life. Jessica was the only person I told about my discoveries. Her advice was characteristically direct: "Keep that evidence close, Alexandra. People who have been getting away with lies for that long can become dangerous when cornered." I had the envelope with me at graduation as a security measure, a last resort I prayed I would not need to use. But as I stood on that stage, publicly disowned and falsely labeled as the product of an affair, I knew the time for hope and reconciliation had passed. The envelope felt heavy in my hands as I broke the seal, my decision made. I was done being the family scapegoat, done carrying the weight of secrets that were not mine to bear. If Richard wanted to shatter the facade of our family in public, then he would face the full consequences of the truth he had hidden for so long. I took the microphone back with a calm that surprised even me. Dean Lawrence hesitated beside me, clearly torn between restoring order to the ceremony and allowing me the chance to respond to such a public attack. Thank you all for witnessing what appears to be an important moment in the Harrison family history. I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Since my father has chosen to share his version of the truth with all of you today, I feel compelled to complete the picture. I looked directly at Richard, whose expression of righteous anger was beginning to falter in the face of my composure. Kathleen's hand had tightened on his arm, her confident smile slipping as she registered the envelope in my hands. My father spoke about DNA and truth. I continued, carefully removing the first document from my envelope. Interesting topics from a man who has maintained two separate families for over 15 years. A fresh wave of gasps rippled through the audience. Richard's face drained of color. For those who may be confused, allow me to clarify. While I have been working part-time jobs to cover expenses, because my father claimed financial strain, Richard Harrison has been supporting a complete separate household in Chicago. I held up a photograph, Richard with his arm around a woman, two teenagers beside them. This is Margaret Williams, along with Trevor and Lucy, my apparent half-siblings who have enjoyed the full financial support of the Harrison fortune, including tuition payments to Northwestern University that were made in the same month that my Yale tuition went mysteriously unpaid. Richard stepped into the aisle. Alexandra stopped this immediately. His commanding tone, which had intimidated me my entire life, now sounded merely desperate. I am simply following your example of public truth-telling, father, I replied, my voice amplified by the microphone. Would you like me to stop? We could have kept all of this private, but you chose this venue. He remained frozen in the aisle as I continued methodically laying out document after document on the podium. What my father neglected to mention in his dramatic announcement is that the money he has been generously providing for my education was actually from a trust fund established by my maternal grandmother specifically for this purpose. A trust fund that, according to these financial records, he has been illegally diverting to support his Chicago family. I glanced at Kathleen, whose face had gone from smug to ashen. My stepmother has apparently known about this arrangement for years. Rather than divorcing my father upon discovering his infidelity, she established her own arrangement, silence, in exchange for a very generous lifestyle, all while systematically erasing every trace of my mother from our home and attempting to drive me out as well. Kathleen sank back into her seat, her expression one of naked panic as whispers spread through the rows around her. 3 weeks ago, I met with family lawyer Harold Winters. I continued, holding up another document. He confirmed that my father has been breaching his fiduciary duty by diverting funds from my educational trust. He also informed me of another trust established by my mother that becomes available to me upon graduation, a trust my father has no control over and deliberately concealed from me. Brandon had stood up and was moving away from Richard and Kathleen, his face a mixture of shame and relief as the secrets he had been complicit in keeping were finally exposed. As for the claim that I am not Richard's biological daughter, I said, reaching for the final document in my envelope, Harold provided me with a copy of my birth certificate and my parents' medical records. My mother underwent fertility treatments at Massachusetts General Hospital. I was conceived through in vitro fertilization using my father's sperm and my mother's egg. There was no affair. There was no other man. That was simply one more lie designed to sever me from my inheritance and my identity. The audience had gone from shocked silence to a low rumble of conversation and exclamations. Several people had begun to applaud, including Professor Martin and Jessica's entire family. Security personnel were moving toward Richard, who looked as though he might rush the stage. I never wanted to expose these truths publicly, I said, gathering the documents back into the envelope. Despite years of emotional manipulation and neglect, I kept hoping for reconciliation. But when faced with public humiliation and false accusations, I will not remain silent. I turned to Dean Lawrence, who was watching with an expression of profound sympathy. I apologize for the disruption to the ceremony, sir. I am providing you with copies of these financial records as they pertain to the unpaid tuition balance my father created by diverting my trust funds. The university will find, I believe, that this constitutes fraud. Then I addressed the audience one final time. To my real family, the friends, professors, and mentors who have supported me through my time at Yale, thank you. You have shown me what genuine care and respect look like. I graduate today not as a Harrison by name perhaps, but fully as my mother's daughter in spirit and determination. I handed the envelope to Dean Lawrence and walked off the stage to a spontaneous standing ovation from my fellow graduates. Jessica broke away from her section and met me at the bottom of the steps, wrapping me in a fierce hug as I finally allowed myself to tremble with the aftermath of adrenaline. Across the auditorium, Richard and Kathleen were attempting to leave, but their exit was impeded by both the crowd's reaction and security personnel who had been instructed to escort them from the venue. Brandon remained in his seat, his head in his hands, the weight of complicity and revelation visible in his posture. As Jessica guided me back to my seat, supported by her parents who had made their way to the aisle, I felt a strange lightness despite the chaos around me. For the first time in my life, I had spoken my truth without fear of consequences. The carefully constructed facade of the Harrison family had shattered, but from those fragments I was finally free to construct an identity of my own. The remainder of the graduation ceremony proceeded in a blur. Dean Lawrence made a brief diplomatic statement about family matters being best resolved privately before continuing with the conferral of degrees. When my name was called to receive my diploma, the applause was noticeably louder than for other graduates. I accepted the leather-bound certificate with hands that had finally stopped shaking, managing a genuine smile for the official photographer. As the ceremony concluded and graduates dispersed to find their families, Jessica's parents immediately enveloped me in a group hug. "You are coming home with us tonight," Mrs. Miller stated firmly. "No arguments." Richard and Kathleen were escorted off campus. Jessica informed me, her phone in hand. "Brandon texted me asking where you will be. He wants to talk." "I do not know if I am ready for that," I admitted. "You do not have to decide now," Mr. Miller said kindly. "Let us get through today first." Professor Martin found me in the crowd, her expression a mixture of outrage and concern. "Alexandra, what happened today was unconscionable. The department is behind you completely. We have already scheduled an emergency meeting with financial aid to address your tuition situation." "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by the swift support. "Also," she added more quietly, "3 members of the Board of Trustees witnessed your father's behavior and your response. One of them is a family court judge who has expressed particular interest in the misappropriation of your trust funds. This will not simply disappear." We made our way across campus toward the dorms, planning to collect my belongings. As we approached my residence hall, I stopped short at the sight before me. Piled unceremoniously outside the building were boxes and suitcases, my belongings from both my dorm room and my childhood bedroom at the Harrison house. "They must have had staff bring your things from home while we were at the ceremony," Jessica realized, her voice tight with anger. "At least I do not have to go back there to collect anything," I said, attempting to find a silver lining. Mrs. Miller was already on her phone, arranging for a rental truck to transport my possessions to their home in Connecticut. Mr. Miller and Jessica began organizing the haphazard pile, creating an inventory of what was there and potentially missing. My own phone had been buzzing incessantly. Social media was exploding with versions of what had happened at the ceremony, some wildly inaccurate, others uncomfortably precise. I had messages from extended family members I barely knew, former high school classmates, and even reporters seeking comment on the Yale graduation showdown. That night in the Millers' guest room, the adrenaline finally wore off, leaving me hollow and exhausted. The reality of what had transpired, and what it meant for my future, began to sink in. I had stood up to my father and exposed his lies, but I had also severed my last connection to my family. I was truly on my own now. The following days brought waves of practical challenges and unexpected support. My grandmother Eleanor, whom I had met only a few times as a young child, due to Richard's systematic isolation of my maternal relatives, reached out through Harold. Your grandmother was deeply disturbed to learn of Richard's actions, Harold explained during our meeting. She wants you to know that the trust your mother established is substantial, enough to cover any outstanding tuition and provide you with a modest income while you establish your career. Eleanor would also like to reconnect if you are open to that. Richard's response to the public exposure came in the form of legal threats. Cease and desist letters arrived, claiming defamation and demanding public retraction of my false statements. Harold countered with the evidence we had gathered along with the birth certificate, disproving Richard's claim about my parentage. The threats quickly shifted to settlement, offers attempting to buy my silence. He is desperate to prevent this from reaching court, Harold explained. Several of his business partners were in attendance at graduation. There is already talk of an internal investigation into his financial practices. Kathleen took a different approach, reaching out to mutual acquaintances to spin a narrative about my mental instability and misunderstanding of complex family matters. When that gained little traction, she filed for divorce, attempting to secure her financial position before Richard's professional life imploded completely. Finding housing became my first immediate challenge. While the Millers generously offered their home for as long as I needed, I was determined to establish my independence. With Harold's help accessing the initial funds from my mother's trust, I secured a small sublet apartment near Yale while I figured out my next steps. Job interviews became complicated as news of the graduation incident spread. Some potential employers seemed hesitant, concerned about bringing someone connected to such public drama into their organization. Others were inappropriately curious, asking invasive questions about my family situation rather than my qualifications. 2 weeks after graduation, I received an unexpected email from Margaret Williams in Chicago. The subject line read simply, "I had no idea." "Alexandra," she wrote, "I feel I owe you an apology, though it seems wholly inadequate. I met your father 16 years ago and believed him to be divorced. By the time I learned he had a wife and daughter, I was pregnant with Trevor. Richard compartmentalized his lives so completely that I never fully understood the extent of his deception. I told myself that the financial support he provided was his way of taking responsibility, never questioning where that money came from. Learning that he diverted your educational trust funds to pay for my children's education has been devastating. Trevor and Lucy have asked to meet you when and if you are ever ready. We understand if that day never comes." The email left me with complicated feelings I was not yet ready to process. I archived it without responding, though I did not delete it either. Brandon reached out repeatedly, his texts evolving from defensive. "You did not have to humiliate everyone publicly to apologetic. I should have told you everything sooner to practical. I have some of Mom's jewelry that Kathleen tried to get rid of. It should be yours." Eventually, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between Yale and his apartment in Boston. "I was a coward," he admitted immediately upon sitting down. "I knew what was happening was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my own security if I spoke up." "You were a teenager when you found out," I acknowledged. "And Kathleen is your mother. I understand the impossible position you were in." "But I am not a teenager anymore," he countered. "I had opportunities to warn you, especially when I knew Dad was planning something for graduation. Instead, I gave you a vague heads-up minutes before everything exploded." He slid a small jewelry box across the table. "These were your mother's. Dad gave them to my mom when they got married, but she never wore them. Said they were not her style, but really I think she just wanted to keep them from you. I took them from her safe last week." Inside was a delicate sapphire pendant and matching earrings that I vaguely remembered my mother wearing on special occasions. The sight of them brought an unexpected wave of grief, not just for her loss but for all the years I had been denied her memory. While I navigated these personal earthquakes, the professional aftershocks continued. Richard's financial manipulations had extended beyond my trust fund, triggering investigations into his business practices. Former clients began contacting me, seeking information about their investments. I directed them all to the appropriate authorities, refusing to become entangled in that aspect of his downfall. 1 month after graduation, I received an offer for a position with a publishing house in New York. a junior editor role that aligned perfectly with my literary background. The hiring manager, it turned out, had been in the audience at graduation. "I was impressed by your composure under extraordinary circumstances," she told me during the final interview. "That kind of grace under pressure is rare and valuable in this industry." For the first time since that fateful day, I felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps the public nature of my family's implosion might not define my future after all. 6 months after graduation, I stood in the living room of my new apartment in Brooklyn, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the beginnings of a home that was entirely my own. Through the window, the Manhattan skyline glittered in the early evening light, a view I still found surreal each time I noticed it. My position at the publishing house had evolved from junior editor to leading a small team focused on translated literature, a perfect application of my comparative literature background. The work was challenging and fulfilling, allowing me to build a professional identity separate from the Harrison name and scandal. Financially, I had achieved stability through a combination of my salary and careful management of the trust fund my mother had established. My grandmother Eleanor had become an unexpected source of support, both emotionally and practically. Now in her 80s, she had moved from Arizona to New Jersey to be closer to me, our weekly lunches becoming a cherished routine. "You have your mother's resilience," she often told me. "Elaine would be so proud of how you have handled all of this." Through Eleanor, I had connected with maternal cousins, aunts, and uncles who had been kept at a distance by Richard throughout my childhood. Family gatherings with them felt awkward at first, but gradually evolved into comfortable relationships that helped fill the void left by the Harrison family implosion. News about Richard arrived periodically through Harold or Brandon. His investment firm had undergone a thorough audit revealing numerous ethical violations beyond the misappropriation of my trust fund. While he avoided criminal charges through settlements and plea agreements, his professional reputation was irreparably damaged. The Chicago house had been sold, his assets frozen during divorce proceedings with Kathleen, who was reportedly fighting for every penny she could secure. My therapeutic journey had been perhaps the most significant aspect of my healing process. Weekly sessions with Dr. Lawson helped me untangle the complex web of manipulation, gaslighting, and conditional love that had shaped my understanding of family and self-worth. "What your father and stepmother did was a form of emotional abuse," Dr. Lawson explained during one particularly difficult session. "Your academic achievements were partly driven by a desperate attempt to earn the love and approval that should have been freely given." Learning to recognize these patterns was painful but essential. I began to understand how my perfectionism, my need for external validation, and my reluctance to trust others were all protective mechanisms developed during years of family dysfunction. 3 months into therapy, I finally felt ready to respond to Margaret's email. Our subsequent correspondence was cautious but increasingly open. She shared stories about Trevor and Lucy that helped me see them as individuals rather than symbols of my father's betrayal. Eventually, I agreed to meet them during a work trip to Chicago. The meeting took place in a quiet restaurant near their home. Trevor, now 20, had our father's height and build but none of his coldness. Lucy, 17, reminded me painfully of childhood photos of myself, the same eyes and smile that had come from our father. "We did not know about you until the trust fund investigation started," Trevor explained. "Dad kept his lives completely separate. He told us he had been married before Mom but said his first wife died without children," Lucy added. "Finding out we had a sister was overwhelming." "Half-sister," I corrected automatically, then smiled to soften the words. "We are figuring this out together." That meeting did not instantly create a sibling bond, but it opened a door to possible future relationships uncontaminated by Richard's deception. We agreed to stay in touch, giving ourselves permission to develop connections at our own pace. My relationship with Brandon evolved into something resembling friendship. He had moved to Seattle, deliberately distancing himself from both Richard and Kathleen while establishing his own career path. Our monthly video calls became a space where we could process our shared history while supporting each other's efforts to break dysfunctional family patterns. "I spent years being angry at you for having Dad's attention and approval," he confessed during one call. "I never realized you were fighting for scraps of acknowledgement just like I was." He made us compete for affection that he was incapable of giving freely to either of us. The public nature of my family's disintegration had unexpected positive consequences as well. I received letters and emails from students who had witnessed the graduation ceremony or heard about it afterward, sharing their own stories of family estrangement and finding courage in my response. Watching you stand up for yourself with such dignity showed me it is possible to break free from toxic family dynamics without breaking yourself in the process, one letter read. The writer had subsequently left an abusive home situation and was rebuilding her life. These connections reminded me that our most painful experiences, when shared thoughtfully, could become lifelines for others facing similar struggles. As the one-year anniversary of graduation approached, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed. The person I had been, desperate for Richard's approval, walking on eggshells around Kathleen, measuring my worth through academic achievements, felt like a stranger now. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who understood that family could be chosen rather than merely inherited, someone who recognized that the truth, however painful, was preferable to the most comfortable lie. Someone who knew her own voice and was not afraid to use it. I still had difficult days. Holidays brought complicated emotions. Certain songs or scents could trigger memories of my mother, of the home we had before everything changed. But these moments no longer derailed me completely. I had built a foundation of self-knowledge and genuine relationships that sustained me through the hard times. Perhaps the most important lesson I had learned was that healing is not a destination but a continuing journey. There was no magical moment when the past ceased to matter or the wounds completely disappeared. Instead, there was the daily choice to move forward with authenticity, to honor my experiences without being defined by them, to build a life based on truth rather than appearances. As I look back on that graduation day now, I no longer see only the public humiliation or family secrets exposed. I see the moment I finally chose myself, not out of selfishness, but out of self-preservation and a fundamental commitment to truth. In revealing those family secrets, I freed myself from their power. In losing the family I thought I needed, I created space for the connections I truly deserved. Have you ever had to choose between keeping a painful secret and standing up for your truth? Share your experience in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest conversations lead to the most meaningful growth. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more journeys of overcoming family betrayal and finding strength in vulnerability. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth is never determined by those who fail to see it.